So welcome to our Easter service today, or at least the service that's being held on Easter, because Easter is somewhat peripheral to what I'm going to be talking about today. In most of the services around town, there's going to be a theme of resurrection or perhaps new life. The various earth-centered religious holidays celebrate the end of winter, the coming of spring, fertility, new birth, new life, plants growing. It is the end of the winter, and all things are renewed, and it's a very optimistic and uplifting time of the season, regardless of where you're coming from, regardless of your religious or non-religious beliefs. Most people really relish spring, having been through yet another winter. So in keeping with this mindset, I wanted to do an optimistic and uplifting service. Not that all of my services aren't optimistic and uplifting, but we're going to focus on what has got to be, and I say this in all sincerity, one of the most, if not the most important, uplifting and optimistic theologies in human history, and that is Universalism, one of our two great roots, if you will, for Unitarian Universalism. Now, at its simplest level, Universalism teaches that hell and a loving God are incompatible. And again, for those of you to whom the notion of a God doesn't really mean that much to you, try to set that aside. We're looking at the history of a movement that got us to where we are today, and you can substitute other words or ideas for God if you wish. But the idea that, say, a benevolent universe, or this wonderful mystery that got us to where we are today, that we're sitting here and talking and interacting with each other and experiencing things, that something like this is incompatible with the notion that our end result is eternal damnation, at least for some of us. And in most simple terms, a loving God doesn't torture people. And this is what the Universalists ultimately came to believe. There are, of course, variations on this. I'm not going to get into it today, but just like the Unitarians had their big split, and if you remember, you had the Socinians and the Arians, and one believed that Jesus was purely human, and the other believed that Jesus was divine, but not God, and so they couldn't get along. Universalists split a little bit too. Some Universalists believe that when you die, you do go into some form of temporary punishment, sort of like purgatory for the Catholic Church. You've got to work off those bad things first, but ultimately, everyone gets saved. Everyone goes to heaven. And then on the other hand, there are those who believe in universal salvation. Everyone goes to heaven. The punishments that you deserve occur in this life. But when you die, you don't have to dread what comes next. And so the Universalists didn't fight as much as the Unitarians did over their divisions. And we'll look at that another day. But understand that the end result for all Universalists was we're all united together again in the end. And this is the simple and ultimately optimistic truth of Universalism. We are all going to the same place. We're all in it together. There's not two groups. There's not the elect or the saved or the blessed or the chosen and the rest. We're all in it together. All of humanity's in it together. And that is ultimately an uplifting and encouraging premise to build a theology on. At least I believe that. Our story also begins, in America at least, with a really amazing story. And it is a true story. It's a well-documented story. It's not one of those legends that springs up in so many religions. This one really happened. And it's key to the formation of Universalism in America. It begins with a man named John Murray. He was born in England in 1741. And he became a Methodist at a young age, the same Methodist that we have today in the United Methodist Church, or some other branches of Methodism, whatever it is. I'm not sure what they would call it. But he was a Methodist, and this was early in the Methodist movement. And anyone who knows the name John Wesley, who was the founder, he's alive at this time. So this is early in that movement. In 1760, he decides that he is going to confront a Methodist minister. And by the way, all the churches I'm talking about right now are Methodist churches in which Universalism sprang out in England, just like it was the Congregationalist churches that gave birth to Unitarians. So within this, there was this Methodist preacher who was preaching universalism. And he had been corrupting people, and John Murray had spoken to a woman. He was going to correct her because she had heard this horrible theology, and he wanted to get her back on the straight and narrow. But she confounded him instead. And her arguments were so persuasive, he thought, oh, this guy is evil. Look how he's got this poor woman twisted around. I'm going to go confront him. And he went, listened to his sermon, and was all ready to chew him out afterwards. But instead, he was moved to become a Universalist by the arguments of that preacher. Now, that's not the miracle story. We're not even close yet. But even that's kind of interesting, that a guy goes to a church determined to chew out the pastor, get him straightened out, and instead converts himself. So he became a Universalist, and he began preaching that message within the Universalist church. Within the Methodist church, sorry. And guess what? He got the attention of John Wesley himself. That's not a good thing if you're getting the attention of the founder of the church you're in because you're speaking things that he doesn't agree with. And so Murray, over the course of several years, was corrected, but he wouldn't budge from this notion of universalism. And ultimately, he was excommunicated from the Methodist Church. Shortly afterwards, his wife and young son were both killed in a plague. And so between these three things, he had hit rock bottom. Kicked out of the church, lost his wife, lost his son, and he decided he was going to immigrate to America and start over. The memories and the pain were just too great in England, and he decided to leave. Now we're going to shift, because the story has two parts. We go back to 1703, back to England again. This time it's a man named George de Benneville. At age 16, he had a vision that he had been redeemed. And it was such a convincing vision or a dream or whatever it was, because he felt that if someone as vile as he could be saved, then all would be saved. And this thing moved him so deeply and so thoroughly that he started talking about universalism and saying that everyone is going to be saved. A loving God will save all people. He too was promptly excommunicated from the Methodist Church. So you cannot be a Universalist and stay in the Methodist Church for very long. Keep that in mind when you drive down by that big United Methodist Church on Jackson Street. The history there is excommunicate Universalists, much as the history of, say, the Presbyterians was to execute Michael Servetus, a Unitarian. The roots, when you go back far enough, it's like, it's a good thing we all get along now, because back in the past, maybe not so much. So, George de Benneville, having also been excommunicated, decides that he's going to preach this Universalist message. And he does this throughout Europe, and then he immigrates to America. And in America, helps to print the first German language Bible that was printed in America. All the Universalist passages, anything that would seem to promote universalism, was in bold print. So, much like the red letter editions that have all of Jesus' words in red, this Bible had all the Universalist words in bold print. And as he went through Pennsylvania preaching, there was a farmer who was illiterate who heard the Universalist message. His name was Thomas Potter. And he too had a vision or a dream in which God spoke to him and said if he built a chapel, God would send a Universalist preacher to be the minister in that chapel. Somewhat like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. This is exactly what happened. And so he did. He built a chapel with no guarantee that he would ever have a minister in that chapel. So in 1760, this is the same year that Murray went to challenge that Universalist preacher and correct him, and instead got converted himself. Thomas Potter, at the age of 71, built a chapel in New Jersey. He allowed itinerant preachers to speak there, those who didn't have their own church. And he kept hoping to hear this promised Universalist message that he had had in his dream. Took 10 years. But 10 years later, as John Murray is on the ship sailing to America, after he's had all this heartbreak in England, his ship is blown off course in a storm and gets stuck on a sandbar off the coast of New Jersey. See where this is going? John Murray joins a party to get off the ship to look for provisions while they're waiting for the tide to rise. And the first person he meets is Thomas Potter, yes. Yes, it's not a movie script. It's real. He meets Thomas Potter. Potter learns that Murray used to be a preacher and says, hey, I've got this chapel here. I don't have a preacher. Sunday's coming up. Could you come and speak? And Murray says, as long as the ship's still stuck on the sandbar, sure. I'll be happy to preach there on Sunday. And sure enough, on Sunday morning, the ship's still stuck. Murray lets the crew know he's going to go preach in this chapel just in case they can sail. And he preaches the Universalist message that Thomas Potter had waited 10 years to hear. And not only that, after he preached the sermon and the service was over, that afternoon the sailor comes and tells him, hey, the ship's off the sandbar, we can sail now. Instead, Murray decides to stay right here, and he becomes the minister there at Potter's Chapel. And he does that for 4 years. After he leaves to go on to a bigger church, Potter died soon afterwards, having been part of this incredible series of improbable events that would be very easy to call a miracle. The chapel still exists today also, if you ever want to go see it. It's called the Murray Grove Unitarian Universalist Retreat and Renewal Center. Now, if I just stopped right there, that's the great sermon for a day that you want to be uplifting and motivating. And that really happened. It's not like the stories you hear of the ancient religious leaders where all these crazy things are happening. You go, yeah, right. This one's documented, and the building still stands. So make of it what you will. It's an amazing thing. And we're going to go into this more on another sermon of how Universalism grew out of this amazing event. But I want to tell you another uplifting story. And now we're going to shift gears completely. Because we're going to talk about an evangelical pastor who became more or less a Universalist. His name is Rob Bell, and he was the founding pastor of Mars Hill Bible Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this is one of those churches that started small and just exploded into a megachurch. At its height, they had been given a shopping mall to use as their church. Yeah, I'm waiting for someone to give us a shopping mall. They had 11,000 people attend on a Sunday.
That's a lot of decorating.
That is a...
Tullahoma.
Yeah, can you imagine being, say, a board member of a church of 11,000 people? That's scary in and of itself. He wrote a book recently, just a couple years ago, called Love Wins. And I'm going to share some of it with you now. And after you hear this horrible doctrine that he preaches in this book, this terrible message, you can understand why it generated so much controversy that he had to leave Mars Hill Bible Church, the church he built, because of these horrible, horrible things he was saying, like this. Years ago, we had an art show at our church. I had been giving a series of teachings on peacemaking, and we invited an artist to display their paintings, poems, sculptures that reflected their understanding of what it meant to be a peacemaker. One woman included in her work a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, and a number of people found this quite compelling, but not everyone. Someone attached a piece of paper to this work, and on the piece of paper was written, "Reality check, he's in hell." Really? Gandhi's in hell? He is? We have confirmation of this? Somebody knows this, without a doubt? and that somebody has taken on the responsibility of leading the rest of us to know? So in this book, what Rob Bell does, he doesn't particularly present a universalist message. What he does is challenge the notion of eternal torment in hell. And a lot of it is done through asking questions and letting you come to your own conclusions. Just like this. Really? Gandhi is in hell? We know this? So ask yourself the things you assume to be true. Ask yourself these questions. How do you know it? At the end of the book, after he's done this and tried to lead people to a different understanding of the passages in the Bible that are used to preach eternal torment, he writes, inquisitions, persecutions, trials, book burnings, blacklisting, when religious people become violent. For some, the highest form of allegiance to their God is to attack, defame, and slander others who don't articulate matters of faith as they do. Jesus was very clear that that's destructive, that's a destructive, violent understanding of God that can easily be institutionalized in churches, systems, and ideas. It's important that we're honest about this, because some churches are not life-giving places, draining people until there's very little left. That God is angry, demanding, a slave driver. And so that God's religion becomes a system of sin management, constantly working and angling to avoid what surely must be the coming wrath that lurks behind every corner, every thought, and every sin. So Bell asks these sorts of questions and gives you these warnings. And he dismantles many of the arguments of eternal torture, but he leaves the final conclusions to the reader. So I'm not going to call him a universalist, although his book is certainly pointing that way. He never made that claim. He may today, I'm not sure. One can argue that he was just waffling and that such a message was... But if you argue that he was waffling, remember that this message was enough to force him to resign and move on. He was no longer welcome in his church. This horrible teaching, like, Gandhi's in hell? Really? We know this? That got people really mad when you ask those sorts of questions. But he's not a Christian. He must be in hell. And he says, how do you know? Have you been there? There was an old character, Baron Munchausen, who used to tell these crazy stories to his nephews. And they'd say, that didn't happen. He goes, how do you know, Charlie? Were you there? Something like that. I hope I'm not misquoting him. Are you there? Do you know that there's a hell? Do you know that there's a heaven? Do you know what happens when you die? How presumptuous of you to tell others something you cannot really possibly know. You may hope it. You may understand the Bible to teach it. That's different from knowing. And that's dangerous ground if you're leading a fundamentalist or evangelical megachurch and you start saying things like that. That chips away at the foundations. So kudos to him for being bold enough to do that. One more Christian branded a heretic for daring to suggest that God doesn't torture people. So if you are one of the many for whom Christianity may not hold a lot of meaning, please keep in mind that stuff like Rob Bell is doing is important. A more humane Christianity is a good thing for the people in those churches. It's a good thing for our society. It's a good thing for peacemaking. It's a good thing to break down the barriers that divide groups into us and them. If we're all in this together, then the us and them isn't so important. We face calls. We hear them now. We hear them on the news. Calls for religious warfare, literal or figurative. We hear calls for division, dividing one religion from another, from banning certain religions from coming to this country or building their places of worship. We hear these things all the time. Some politicians are telling us that we have to return to a Christian America. One has proposed setting up a department of Judeo-Christian ethics and making it one of the secretary positions. So these things are happening right now. And I can assure you that there are churches in which the pastors attack almost every Sunday unbelievers, or at least the teachings of unbelievers, because we love the sinner, we just hate the sin. That's a great line.
Yeah.
No, what really happens is you end up hating because there's the good group and the bad group, and we need to get past the good group and the bad group mentality. And Universalism helps us with that. And when a well-known Christian leader like Rob Bell, and he was well-known, at least on one list of like the 50 most influential Christians in the country, he was on it. I think he was number 10. So he's not just some guy. He carries weight in the Christian world. And he's now talking about a more or less universalist message. Universalism holds out a couple of hopes that I think are important for us to remember. Even though the definition of universalism changes and evolves, and today universalism within Unitarian Universalism really holds a different idea. It's the idea that we have a shared humanity, a shared hope, a shared destiny, and not so much the idea of everyone goes to heaven, because not all Unitarian Universalists have that kind of theology anymore. So the word itself has evolved in its meaning. But the best way to put it, the hope that this provides, regardless of whether you look at it historically or in a modern setting, first of all, Unitarian Universalists believe we all share the same destiny. Or some people say we all go to the same place when we die, or no place when we die. We don't know, but we're all going to be there together one way or the other. A shared destiny. There are not a lucky few who get eternal bliss and a majority that suffer for all eternity. And too bad if you're one of those folks, but at least the lucky ones, we get to enjoy things. And somehow we get brainwashed so we don't think about the suffering of billions of people, which is what has to happen, or you could not enjoy heaven. How could you enjoy heaven for all eternity in bliss if you knew your neighbors, your family, your friends, your sons, your daughters, parents were suffering eternal torture? Who could call themselves a human and enjoy anything knowing that was happening to someone they loved? That is what is taught, but not thought deeply enough about in some churches. And Universalism gets us away from that. We don't have to live our lives in fear, so we can enjoy our lives. We have just incredible blessings in this country. We have the freedom to come here and share ideas that are not majority-held ideas. And no one's busting the doors down and arresting us and dragging us off to jail or burning us at the stake. We are so fortunate here. Enjoy the blessings of this life. We do not have to constantly look over our shoulder and wonder if we've done something bad and the scales are starting to tip the wrong way, and when we die, we're going to regret it. We can embrace life and enjoy it. We're all in it together. And so that would be the encouragement out of the message of Universalism. We are all one people. We share a common destiny, and we can enjoy this miracle of existence, however brief it may be, and with the mystery of what comes after. We can be happy and joyful and not live in constant fear. Universalism proclaims these truths. We are all together, all of us, a common heritage and a common faith. And this is a true blessing. And so on this day when we celebrate rebirth, life, miracles, resurrection, or whatever it is that Easter means to you, I would ask you to take away from this wonderful gift that our Universalist forebears gave us, that we can find joy, peace, and happiness in our common everyday activities, not fear and dread. We don't have to constantly ask ourselves what pleases God and what doesn't. We can simply enjoy the blessings of this existence, and we can look at each other as brothers and sisters in a common faith, a common humanity, and a common destiny. Thank you so much for coming today, and may we take these truths with us.